wanted to say Martin Luther King Jr. And I think just saying his name, it naturally evokes a lot of emotions and thoughts. So I wanted to take a moment, and if people want to say, not all at the same time, but if you raise your hand, how you feel when someone says that name out loud. What the emotions does it evoke, or what do you feel?
Depressed in January. Only in January.
Anyone else?
Proud.
I want to say inquisitive, because I did part of my growing up here, but I'm originally from Venezuela, so we didn't know too much about him in Latin America or whatever. I guess we knew some things about him, but just the superficial, the peripheral that you get here in school. So
I think that primarily, as a fact, would really be one of the key points in terms of my presentation, is because, you know, today undoubtedly is one of many presentations that's going to take place, sure tonight, but over the next couple of days, as well as in the next week, all leading up to the official holiday on the 17th of January. And then, even though it's going to happen for his birthday, we can see again when February comes around and people talk about Black History Month in classrooms, in forums, in speeches, the main thing that's talked about is Dr. Martin Luther King and his legacy. And many attempt to, and often fail, often try to sum up his legacy, kind of his meaning in a few short minutes, or half an hour, or several hours. I promise you, I'm not going to try for several hours. But they find themselves falling short of the actual mark of what he meant in terms of history and what his contribution was to the movement. They find themselves lacking enough words or enough emotion or anything to really describe his presence and what he meant, not just to the civil rights movement, but to the movement for social justice. Martin Luther King Jr. is no longer remembered really for his contributions, but instead he is equated equally or becomes synonymous with the entire civil rights movement. His leadership and foresight about the importance of the movement really helped to shape our interpretation of the fight by African Americans for civil rights in the United States. But we must also at the same time recognize the Montgomery bus boycott, the Greensboro sit-ins, a national march in Washington, D.C., which, as an aside, he actually wasn't even supposed to speak at, because one of the primary reasons he was speaking was because of the Montgomery bus boycott. And Rosa Parks initially was saying, should I say something? But because of sexism within the movement at that time, they said, no, you've already said enough. And hence that is how he came to speak at that time. But what we could see is all of these things really already would have taken place if he had not been a leader, if he had not been fighting for justice within the civil rights movement. He was not the initial driving or even sustaining force behind these movements. These actions, in fact, took place because of the people. The civil rights movement was a revolutionary response to the institutionalized racism directed against African Americans. Karl Marx said, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. And what we could see was that the civil rights movement was really an expression of this struggle. And the civil rights movement, in addition to many other struggles that were taking place at that time, were in fact all part of what people could actually see, even the bosses or capitalist owners themselves, was really the beginning or the foreshadowing of a socialist revolution. And so in order to avoid that, concessions were made to the African American community. But we could see it was the people, oppressed workers, that were rising up against their oppressors by carrying out a political revolution against the apartheid South that really was the determining factor of the civil rights movement. Today, we would say, when I say a revolution, when I talk about the civil rights movement, we within the Party for Socialism and Liberation would say there have actually been 3 revolutions within the United States. The American Revolution, the U.S. Civil War, and then what we would call the Civil Rights Revolution. The American Revolution we consider to be a revolution, but more so on a political level, because you could see that in the American Revolution they were almost eager really to shed their colonial status, but they were not as eager and really almost in complete opposition to shedding chattel slavery or capitalism. The ruling tenets at that time that we often talk about are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But when you think about women, you think about non-landowning whites. When you think about the enslaved African American population, when you think about Native Americans, you know, the majority of their population was slaughtered because of the pillage and plunder of colonizers, but then also in large part due to disease. None of those tenets considered those factors of society. And pretty much all of those people were in fact excluded from these calls for equality and freedom. The U.S. Civil War, we would say, was a social revolution because it actually smashed chattel slavery within the United States. Rather than being a purely political transformation, the social and economic status of African Americans changed. The owners were quote-unquote stripped of their property, that meaning that they were stripped of slaves, and for the first time African Americans within the United States were actually allowed to control the most basic right, that is, control over their own bodies. Finally, what we'd say is that the Civil Rights Movement destroyed the Jim Crow Southern rule by granting full rights to African Americans, and thus also being a political revolution. So many times we read about people who try to sum up what Martin Luther King was, and in 2005, Claiborne Carson, who was actually the editor of the Martin Luther King papers, wrote to Socialism and Liberation magazine on King's contributions to the Civil Rights Movement. Carson said, "King didn't start the black freedom struggle. We wouldn't be talking about Martin Luther King if it wasn't for Rosa Parks. He might have been a wonderful minister at Ebenezer Baptist Church or even at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, but he wouldn't be talking about him today." When we talk about Martin Luther King, or when we talk about anyone who really fights for social justice, we must recognize them not just as individuals, but really as symbols of something that's much greater. They're symbols of the tremendous struggles that took place to bring about an end to a certain kind of racism that had different faces. They fought against the face of colonialism, the face of apartheid, and with Martin Luther King, he fought against racism and the American Jim Crow system. So if all of us in this room can agree with Carson and have a starting point of recognizing that King is a symbol for something that was greater for the African American community, greater than his speeches, greater than his oration, then what did he contribute to the Civil Rights Movement? What we would say is that he actually provided a framework. During a lecture on the Nobel Prize, not actually his acceptance speech, but beforehand, what he says is that he wanted to talk about 3 universal problems that we see within the United States: war, poverty, and racism. It's so funny because he mentioned those 3 things when he was accepting a prize, but in fact, what we can see is now today he's been relegated primarily only to talking about racism. We are primarily remembering him for his stressing the needs for the civil rights for blacks, but his stance on the Vietnam War is often left out of history entirely. When in fact King himself in fact said, quote, "I had to speak out if I was going to erase my name from the bombs which fall over South and North Vietnam. The time had come, indeed it was in fact past due, when I had to disavow and disassociate myself from those who in the name of peace burn, maim, and kill." In addition, he fought arduously for the rights of workers and for the poor. He became particularly involved in the strike of sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, and prior to his assassination, Martin Luther King was on the brink of a poor people's campaign. Poor people not just being African Americans, but really poor people within the United States to address the massive poverty and inequality that existed for all. Looking back, it is surprising now that he's only remembered for having a dream for black people. Karl Marx said it best, and excuse me for paraphrasing, but that bourgeois society really takes our leaders in the social justice movement, and when they see that they're threatening the capitalist system, instead turns them into infamous and non-threatening icons. But icon or not, it is clear that he had laid out a framework really for progressives, but even for communists as well, about our responsibility. We cannot yell in the streets about the war in Iraq and then at the same time forget the racist laws that are directed against our immigrant community. We cannot fight for women's rights and not speak about full marriage rights for the LGBT community. Over the last 8 years, I want to take a minute and talk about what has happened within the anti-war movement itself. Because we could see at the very beginning it was really people saying that war was not the answer, or saying that we should not go to war in Iraq. But it grew from it being just solely a war against fighting against the war in Iraq to fighting against the war in Iraq, the occupation of Palestine, the occupation of Haiti, fighting for reparations for the people for Hurricane Katrina. And then actually, at the end, directly attacking what was the problem, the social system of imperialism. Today the struggle has broadened to a new level because we can see in the past 8 years, primarily the anti-war movement against the war in Iraq directed a lot of attention against the Bush administration. But today people are seeing that the war is tied not to a particular political party, but instead to a social system that makes profit from making missiles. In December the 16th, we saw that members of March Forward, as well as organizations that joined with them, veterans, and others came out and demonstrated in front of the White House to show their opposition to the war. But they were joining the struggle in a very different way than they did in the Vietnam War. And this was not just a protest, in fact, on December 16th, but also civil resistance. And out of the people that came out, of over 100, almost most of them were arrested. But when we look at the Vietnam War, so many people were able to engage in this type of civil resistance, especially for the veterans from the Vietnam War, but it was primarily based upon the draft. But instead now people are joining because they know that the system is designed to use them as targets and cannon fodder for a war designed to line the pockets of the rich. And now we also know that as a pretext to invade Iraq, they were sought prior to September 11th based on the reports that have been released from WikiLeaks. In addition, today, as mentioned earlier, the struggle against racism is taking a new direction. But historically, when people think about the fight against racism, they always relegate it to the black community. But because of the massive raids that have taken place against the immigrants, we can see that a new movement has emerged within the immigrant community, particularly among Latinos. In the past 3 years, hundreds of thousands of people in the Latino community have protested in front of the White House and other places across the country against the onslaught on their brothers, their sisters, their family, their friends, and that movement continues on a day-to-day basis to grow. When we look at Martin Luther King Jr. and his drum major speech where he says, "I'm a drum major for justice, call me a drum major for peace," he also talks about feeding the poor and the needy. But he wasn't talking about feeding everyone or what we should do on a day-to-day basis or in our community. He was alluding to the need to fight for poverty at its root. We can see right now, for example, in Washington, D.C., there's a movement that is emerging because the D.C. Council wants to cut TANF, or the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. For anyone that's been on the program for more than 5 years, they're saying they should automatically be cut off. So that would be 8,000 families, young women and children primarily, who would no longer receive services. The D.C. Council refers to the budget deficit of almost $700 million, and it's used as a pretext really to cut programs such as TANF, also to look at the Washington Teachers Union contract and say we'll no longer accept this contract because of a budget deficit. But hiring and fees is into effect, and when the employment rate here in Washington, D.C. is way over 9%, but we can see in Southeast for the African American community, particularly African American men between the ages of 18 and 25, it's in fact 15 to 20%. So we have to say, what do we have today? An anti-war movement, an anti-racism movement, an anti-poverty movement. It is analogous to the time of Martin Luther King, and what he realized is that these movements must unite in order to be successful. His leadership showed a new way, or a new step forward for the movement. He was dangerous to the political establishment because he started to draw the connection between these struggles. Even though he is recognized as the leader of the civil rights movement, he called for something much greater. To move the movement forward, we must recognize that Dr. King was saying that the struggle needs to take the next step. Our goal as leaders is not solely to be leaders in one or individual or even two particular struggles, but rather to make the connection. Instead, we must be leaders that connect the struggle against war, racism, poverty, anti-gay bigotry, sexism, and all forms of oppression, and rather say that it's a revolution that will be able to solve all of these problems. And it would be impossible to carry out this task alone, but we must also look to the leaders of these other struggles as well, and unite with them and show our solidarity. When we remember Dr. King, we should remember him not as a speaker at a rally or a participant in a demonstration, but as a man who attempted to connect the various forms of oppression into a single struggle against social injustice. The only way to fight that social injustice is to remove the foundation which births and feeds it. So let us remember him by becoming involved in the struggle with the aim of revolution.